So hi everyone, welcome back to the lectures on human rights. Today's topic is going to be development of human rights regime. So let's just get to it. Until now, what we have covered are the ancient human rights law, and as you can see, I have put the years over there, so to give you some idea of how we have gone about it chronologically speaking. So of course, we have discussed the ancient human rights law. We stopped around 231 BCE when we were discussing the Ashoka edicts. Then we have discussed the Magna Carta, which came out in 1215 CE. The Renaissance period that was supposed to be there around 1300 to 1500 CE. The Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights, that was 1689. The US Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights at 1776. And of course, the Bill of Rights was created in 1789 but ratified in 1791. And the last one is the French Declaration of Bill of Rights of Man and of the Citizen that we have already covered. So these are the topics that we have already covered. So now we are going to start with what exactly are the human rights that we look at today. So in this presentation, specifically, I would be looking at the ILO, the League of Nations, and of course, I will also refer to something known as the Treaty of Versailles. I would be looking at the Declaration of International Rights of Man. Of course, I will also refer to the UN Charter and the Nuremberg Trials. Whichever topics I'm referring to briefly, those are depicted over here. So the first one, of course, is the ILO and the League of Nations. While referring to the ILO, I will just give a brief reference because the next slide is going to deal with the League of Nations. So I'll just refer to it briefly with the ILO that is, and to give you some idea what it was all about. So yeah, as you can see, this is the whole logo of the League of Nations, and this was the organization that was created after the First World War, and it was created after a specific treaty that we call the Treaty of Versailles. And this treaty was the peace treaty which ended the First World War. So the League of Nations was created as a result of it. Just FYI, the International Labour Organization will also be created as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So, of course, I will just read from the slide now. It says the League of Nations was formed after the end of the First World War on 10th January 1920. Wilson's 14 points formed the basis of the Versailles Peace Treaty in 1919, which established the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization. Wilson is, of course, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States of America at that point of time. The League was supposed to preserve international peace and security through the collective action of its member states against any state that resorted to war or the threat of war. Three developments are relevant. Of course, this is with respect to human rights. Three developments are relevant: the minorities treaties, the development of international workers' rights, and the work on the abolition of slavery. So, something that I've already told you is that the League of Nations was formed after the First World War on 10th January 1920. This was one of the, there was a Versailles Peace Treaty, just like I told you, after the First World War. And Wilson's 14 points formed the basis of this peace treaty. So Wilson was Woodrow Wilson. As I told you, he was the president of the US and he was very influential at that point of time. And of course, this peace treaty would establish the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization. The League was supposed to preserve international peace and security through the collective action of its member states, something similar to what the United Nations does. And for our purposes, for understanding human rights, because League of Nations was an international organization dedicated to peace. That is not going to form part of our lectures. What is going to form part of our lectures is, of course, the idea of human rights. And three developments in the League are relevant to us. First, the minorities treaties. Second, development of international workers' rights. And third, of course, the work on the abolition of slavery. So let's just get right to it. Now, the first one, of course, is the minorities treaties. So it says these League of Nations efforts to legally recognize and protect minority rights were an important development, as on the one hand, they signaled attempts to protect individual rights through international law, and on the other hand, they rebutted the argument that the way a state treats its inhabitants is not a subject of legitimate international concern. Yet, despite its important contribution to the protection of minority rights, the human rights protection offered under the League system was obviously limited to certain groups and certain countries. Now, what they're talking about is that once the League of Nations was formed and it was looking at some issues of human rights, that's not its mandate, but it starts looking at those things. So, of course, it's looking at the minority rights. And while it's looking at the minority rights, we have these treaties that are coming up that legally recognize and protect minority rights in different countries. Now, before the League of Nations is created, the concept of sovereignty is very strong. Even today, it is very strong. So, the whole idea of sovereignty is that no nation can be taken to be under the will of another country. What that means is that each nation is independent and it is it can do whatever it wants to its citizens. That was the idea. But the League of Nations comes up with certain minorities treaties. They apply to various countries. That is not relevant to us. We don't need to study that. The only thing you need to know is that through these treaties, they attempt to protect individual rights through international law. And of course, they also say that no longer can you just say that these are our citizens, we can do anything to them. If minorities are there, whoever is there, the fact of the matter is that the international community can intervene if you are misbehaving with the minorities in your country. So that signals the beginning of some sort of a human right here. Of course, if you look at the second point, it says, yet despite its important contribution to the protection of minority rights, the HR protection offered under the League system was obviously limited to certain groups and certain countries. So, of course, see, League of Nations had very less membership as compared to the UN today. And of course, we have to understand that during this time, it's just at a nascent stage, and the human rights development for minorities, no, won't be that big. But we have to understand the inception over here, and that is what we're looking at. Now, I'm going to look at the next part. Of course, I told you at the beginning that we are looking at three things: minorities treaties. Now, second is international workers' rights. So, the League of Nations was also active in the protection of workers' rights. The goal of fair and humane conditions of labor for men, women, and children was stated explicitly in the League Covenant. This goal became central to the work of the International Labour Organization, which continues today as one of the UN's specialized agencies, and we'll get back to that. While the minorities treaties and the development of workers' rights can be seen as embryonic stages of the development of international human rights, we should be aware that these arrangements were put in place by governments in their state's interests. The human rights of individuals were granted legal protection on the basis of the individual ties to a state, and in order to reduce political tensions among states that might lead to war, workers' rights were to be recognized and protected, as this was seen by some states as the best way to prevent their populations from turning to communism and to reduce the risk of revolution. Now, what they're trying to say over here, that first of all, the first point, that's pretty straightforward, that the League of Nations was also active in the protection of workers' rights. So this was also another mandate that it was looking at. And at this point of time, there is no such law that children cannot work, and those laws are not there. So the treaty itself and the League of Nations itself, the Treaty of Versailles, that is what I was referring to, it talks about creating fair and human conditions of labor for men, women, and children. And of course, this was also contained in the League's Covenant. Now, the League's Covenant is nothing. For example, you have the United Nations Charter. So for the League of Nations, it had the Covenant of the League of Nations. Anyway, third point, this goal became central to the work of the ILO, which continues today as one of the UN's specialized agencies. Now, what work are they talking about? The goal of fair and humane conditions of labor for men, women, and children. That is what they're talking about. Now, before I get to the next point, you need to understand something. Now, while the First World War was going on, at that time there was a revolution in a specific European country, European and Asian country to be frank. And that country happened to be the Russian Empire. And it was the monarchy over there was removed, and Russia became a communist state. Now, the idea of communism is something which is very different from the idea of other European countries at this point of time. These countries were capitalist, and they feared that if their workers, because even the idea of communism and most of the posters that we see, it says workers of the world unite. And the idea was that if at this point of time we do not take into account the demands of our workers, I'm talking about the capitalist countries, of course, then our people will rise up in revolt. And they might just throw our regimes up too, because there was a monarchy in Russia, and they just there was a rebellion, and everyone is removed from there. So rather than wait for the communist revolution in Europe, we will try to look at the conditions of labor for men, women, and children in the capitalist system only. And we will try to give them all the rights that they want in this system. For this, they have established the League of Nations. And of course, specifically, they did establish something known as the International Labor Organization. On that note, let's just continue. These three, the points, they happen to be some things which I've already told you. So I'll just switch to the last one. The workers' rights were to be recognized and protected, as this was seen by some states as the best way to prevent their populations from turning to communism and to reduce the risk of a revolution. So I hope you get it. Yeah, this is the another aspect of what the League of Nations was looking at. So it says that the efforts to combat slavery had been ongoing in the 19th century. So League of Nations would also look at that. Although strategic and economic forces played a role in the abolition of slavery, there was also a genuine sentiment that slavery was inhuman. Non-governmental organizations such as Anti-Slavery Society lobbied for international action, and the fight against slavery is sometimes seen as the beginning of the human rights movement. The League set up commissions on slavery, adopted 1926 Slavery Convention, and developed conventions on the traffic in women and children to suppress what had been called in 1910 Convention the white slave traffic. So let's just discuss this. From the 19th century, there was a lot of problem regarding slavery. So it was banned in various countries, and there were international treaties coming up. Now, in fact, there was a war. One of the reasons for the American Civil War, which would occur in the 1860s, was slavery. The southern states wanted it to be there, the northern states did not. Now, in the 20th century, in the 1920s, when the League of Nations starts working, even then there is a problem of slavery. Even today, we have a problem of slavery, indentured labor, and all those things. These problems keep coming up. So, the League of Nations, in pursuance and while pursuing its goal of somewhere giving human rights, it is also talking about its efforts to combat slavery. And all the strategic and economic forces played a role in the abolition of slavery. There was also a genuine sentiment that slavery was inhuman. This is the idea at that point of time. And NGOs would be fighting for this problem. Fine. The League, and this is the important part, only the only important part we have to look at. The League set up commissions on slavery, and it adopted the 1926 Slavery Convention, and it developed conventions on the traffic in women and children to suppress what had been called in 1910 Convention of White Slave Traffic. Fine, not that. What matters is that when we are talking about the League's goals regarding human rights, so these are the three things that the League ultimately looked at. Of course, while I was talking about this whole lecture for the day, I also told you that I'll be looking at the ILO briefly. So let's do that now. The only reference that I made to the ILO, that was regarding the workers' rights. So here's the thing. The International Labour Organization would be created through the statute, and not through the statute, but the Treaty of Versailles. The aim of ILO would be to give fair and human conditions of labor for men, women, and children. And it would keep working, and it is still coming up with treaties. In fact, India has signed up various treaties in the previous couple of years. So the ILO's main idea is that it creates fair and humane conditions. It tries to create those conditions by creating international treaties and making countries sign them. That's how the ILO works. And it has been working since 11th April 1919. It was a creation of the Treaty of Versailles. That's enough for the ILO. So that's enough. Now coming to the Declaration of International Rights of Man, 1929. Now, if I just go back and look at the topics that we're looking at, so ILO and League of Nations has been dealt with. Now I'm talking about the Declaration of International Rights of Man. It's a short document that I'll be looking at. Now, this specific declaration came out in 1929. Let's read about it. After World War I, questions were raised about human rights and fundamental freedoms. In 1929, the Institute of International Law adopted the Declaration of International Rights of Man. The declaration declared that fundamental rights of citizens, recognized and guaranteed by several domestic constitutions, especially the French and the US constitutions, were in reality meant not only for citizens of the states, but also for all men all over the world without any consideration. So it's simply one declaration which came out through the Institute of International Law. And basic idea that they came up with, that a lot of domestic constitutions have human rights and have rights inside those documents. So we opine that the French and US constitution, whatever rights are there, they are not only for the citizens, but they should be rights for all the men in the world without any consideration. So yeah, something that you need to know. Of course, you're already aware of the rights, the 10 rights that we have already discussed with respect to the Constitution of the United States of America. They come up with more rights later on, but those are the ones which are most relevant when we are discussing this. Now, next one, of course, is the UN Charter. Now, the UN Charter happens to be the document which we will be discussing in the next unit. So I will be discussing it very briefly over here. The United Nations Charter was drafted, approved, and unanimously adopted by all the delegates of the 51 states who attended the United Nations Conference at San Francisco on June 26, 1945. The UN Charter contains provisions for the promotion and protection of human rights. The importance of the Charter lies in the fact that it is the first official document in which the use of human rights is, for the first time, traceable, and which also recognizes the respect for fundamental freedom of man. And of course, the UN Charter would come to be known as the World Constitution as the times roll on, because it would be accepted by most of the countries of the world. So that's enough for the UN Charter. Uh, the UN Charter, of course, laid down the foundation of the United Nations. So that's that. Now, the next topic, of course, is this, that is the Nuremberg trials. So let's just get right to it. Now, once the Second World War ended, the German Nazis and war criminals, they had to be punished somehow. So there were a lot of advisories coming. How should we deal with them, and how should we actually make it work? So they came up with the idea of the Nuremberg trials. So I'll just read now. The Nuremberg trials were a series of international military tribunals in the German city of Nuremberg. Senior Nazis were tried for the crimes committed in World War II. The first and best known trial was of the major war criminals held between 20th November 1945 and 1st October 1946. The charges were crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Genocide wasn't a separate crime, but was included as a war crime. Now, these ultimately, if you look at this, these are crimes against humanity, there's this genocide and everything. So these are per se violations of human rights. You can't kill people indiscriminately. You can't just kill a group of people indiscriminately. All those things, right? They'll be classified as crimes. But all of these crimes are per se violations of human rights. That is why it becomes important for us. Now, in this image, as you can see, this is view from above of the judges bench at the International Military Tribunal. What is necessary to see over here is that there were 4 judges, right? And as you can see, there are flags behind them. Maybe you can guess which countries they belong to. So, of course, they were supposed to belong to 4 countries. That is Britain, Russia, France, and the US. So, yeah. The first flag is, of course, Russia. The second is Britain. The third one is the United States. And the fourth one, of course, is France. So 24 defendants and 7 organizations were prosecuted, including the Nazi Party secretary, the commander of the German Air Force, Hitler's deputy, and the publisher of an anti-Semitic newspaper. There were 4 judges, one each from Britain, Russia, France, and the US, rather than the jury, just like I told you. So as you can see, like there are going to be 4 judges, and the flags represent their countries. The sentences ranged from 10 years imprisonment to death by hanging and were imposed on 12 defendants. Why were they imposed? Because they participated in certain crimes which violated human rights of people. And those crimes, of course, were crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and of course, they also refer to genocide. Now, over here, you can see this is a photograph. So it says over here that the main target of the prosecution was Hermann Goring, considered to be the most important surviving official in Nazi Germany. He was like one of the people who collaborated with Hitler, in sending the Jews to the camps, and a lot of crimes that took place in Germany at that point of time, crimes against humanity. So he was the main target of the prosecution. You can see him, he's sitting at the left. Now, the trial led to the 7 Nuremberg Principles, which list the legal principles that were recognized by the Charter for the International Military Tribunal and its judgments. The principles include individual responsibility, that heads of state or government can be held liable under international law, orders by a superior is no defense, and a list of crimes punishable under international law. These principles were adopted by the UN General Assembly and are today widely considered to represent customary international law, that is, laws that have developed through custom rather than by formal agreement or legislation. So the point is this: these Nuremberg trials that are going on, they will ultimately lead to the formation of certain principles, and those principles are known as the seven Nuremberg principles. You know, crimes against humanity, genocide, and all these will be termed as crimes even only after the Nuremberg trials. And of course, these would be recognized by the Charter for the International Military Tribunal and its judgments. Now, this term individual responsibility, it's very important. It means that if we finally recognize that the state being, even though it says that it's all powerful, it can do whatever it's to its citizens, no, it can't. Because there are certain things under international law that a state should not be allowed to do. And if those things are done, if genocide is done, if wars, crimes against humanity are done, then at that point of time, the person can be held into account. The person being the head of the state or that individual who ordered that menace to be started. So again, it says the principles include individual responsibility. That's one thing. Second, it also says that heads of state or government can be held liable under international law. So that's something unique. You are a king, you are at the top, not a king, but you are an elected official, you are at the top of a country. But suddenly there is another regime of laws to which you can be held to be liable in case you conduct anything that goes against those laws. And those laws, of course, happen to be international laws. Then another principle that came up was that orders by a superior is no defense. So most of the Nazi war criminals, and most of them, their plea was that we were under direct orders of the Führer or our superiors, and if we did not do what they had told us to do, if we did not send the Jews to the death camps, to the concentration camps, then we would have been court-martialed, and therefore we were following strict orders. You cannot say that we did something wrong. But the tribunal comes up with this idea that orders by a superior is no defense, and that seals their fate. And of course, a list of crimes punishable under international law came up. Of course, I've referred to them again and again. I'm talking about genocide, crimes against humanity, and all those things. These principles were again adopted by the UN General Assembly and are today widely considered to represent customary international law. So, genocide, these things, the crimes against humanity, all of them are recognized by customary law. If any nation, person, individual commits such a crime, they're going to be held liable under international law because they have violated the sanctity of certain aspects of human rights that we consider to be very sacred. So yes, that is all about the Nuremberg trials. So I'll just recap. Today what we have discussed is that we have looked at the ILO briefly, and while discussing the ILO, of course, we have referred to the idea that it started with the Versailles Treaty of Versailles, and its aim was to make sure that the various, children, women, and men, all of their workers' rights are respected. Same went for the League of Nations. And while I was discussing the League of Nations, I told you that it looked at the rights of the minorities, development of international workers' rights, and the work on abolition of slavery. Once we were done with that, I have discussed with you the Declaration of International Rights of Man from 1929, which simply states that rights given in several domestic constitutions, especially the French and the US constitutions, were in reality meant not only for citizens of the states, but also for men all over the world without any consideration. And of course, I've discussed the UN Charter very briefly with you. And I have ended the lecture by discussing the Nuremberg trials and how they came up with the principles that will define crimes against humanity and other things. These principles will come to be known as the seven Nuremberg principles. So that's all. Uh, Thank you so much.